Welcome to this web lecture about the use of widgets in graphical user interfaces. In your project, you are probably going to use a lot of window gadgets or widgets for different parts of the interaction. And we want to repeat some of the advice that we've scattered over other web lectures regarding the use of graphical elements. So we'll give you examples of typical GUI elements as they are used, good examples and bad examples, right, in interfaces. They can be described using different types. There are dialog boxes for short interaction and yes/no choices, and they can be modal or non-modal. And you need to consider how to exit from each dialog box. We have tabbed interfaces versus pop-up windows. And so we'll see when to use which. There are standards, and when a standard is available for what you want to do, you should do it the standard way rather than your own way. And you can also not expect your users to be experts, especially when you're designing interfaces for novices or interfaces that you expect your users to be able to use without studying manuals. You have to choose also wisely between different input fields like text fields, selection lists, drop-down lists, spinners, sliders, right? All kinds of interfaces for entering or selecting numerical or enumerated data. Let's have first a look at dialog boxes. A modal dialog box is one that must be closed before you can continue using the rest of the interfaces. So it's a pop-up window. It may have an OK and cancel button or a cross in a corner. And the rest of the interface cannot be used as long as the dialog box is there. This is good for handling errors, for instance. Right? You have to choose between yes and no, and the interface cannot be continued until you've made up your mind and made this choice. Clicking on a button should exit the dialog box, but don't forget, pressing the Enter key should actually do the same. You also, and this is very important, never want to tell the user he has to press the OK button when there is a problem that is not OK. Here is an example of a modal dialog box, right, that is actually not a good design. If you read the text that it says there, it is about creating or changing some appointment. And it says that, well, if you change something to the meeting organizer needs to be informed as well. And then you're presented with an option which is called yes, and another option which is called cancel. Is cancel doing the same thing as no? Is there a way to say no? That isn't clear. The whole message, in fact, isn't clear. Is pressing the X, right, is that the same as doing cancel? None of this is clear. Another very bad design is the typical interface that forces you to click OK when there is a problem. And as you can see, they even disabled the X right in the corner. So there is absolutely no way to get out of this dialog box without clicking OK, the last thing you actually want to do. Sometimes non-modal dialog boxes are better. For instance, a non-modal dialog box can be placed to the side and the interaction can be repeated as often as you want and can be interleaved and used in parallel with the rest of the interface. It stays open. You put it out of the way. You can use it, for instance, in Microsoft Office to insert symbols in documents. This is something that you may want to do many times. So you have your document open, you put the dialog box on the side, and each time you need a symbol, you select it from this dialog box. Initially, in old versions of Microsoft Office that were little more than prototypes, right, it was not implemented in a consistent way. For instance, in Office 2003, or also the earlier versions of Office for Macintosh, the dialog box for insert symbol in Word was a non-modal dialog box. You could leave it open. And in PowerPoint, it was not the same design, and it was modal. You could only insert one symbol, and then you had to close the dialog box each time. Nowadays, Office is a real product, and these interfaces are consistent, and they're all non-modal. Tabbed interfaces are good in similar cases where dialog boxes, non-modal dialog boxes especially, are used. There is some interaction with the dialog box, and there is some interaction with the rest of the interface, but if you have several such options, and they're more or less equally important. Right? In Word, editing the document is the important part, and sometimes there is this subsidiary part to insert the symbol. When the parts are equally important, you use a tabbed interface. Here is an example. This is the header of the DP Review website, and it has a large number of sections, all reachable through these tabs. Right? You can go to news or reviews. There are forums, separate parts of the website, all having a consistent look and feel, but dealing with very different aspects, right, of, in this case, digital photography. Similarly, there is the TUE website, which also offers something that looks like they could be tabs. Right? There is the student portal, there is an employee portal, and those really act like tabs. They are separate parts of the website. And there is also a contact part, for instance. But then the designers of the TUE website have mixed up such tabs with direct function buttons, like the letters here to increase or decrease the font size, something which isn't needed at all in modern browsers, as you can increase the font size through some command keystroke or some gestures, right, on your device. And there is also the language switch between English and Dutch, which is also a simple button. So, and this is a bad design. Tabs have been mixed up with other types of buttons. When you need a lot of tabs, right, consider how to design that. They are intended for parallel interface parts that are equally important, and there should be a limited number of them placed next to each other. Right? Here is an example of a program that needed so many different tabs that you end up with different layers of tabs. This is generally a bad idea. Lots of interfaces do not follow standards even though they exist. Like if you want to rename a file nowadays, do you recognize this interface? What do? You go to an Explorer or Finder and you click on the name of the file, and it changes into a text field where you can enter a new name or edit the name that is there. You do not use a dialog box for that. And when you want to show an error message, there are standard icons like a cross to indicate something is really wrong. Here there is a dialog box, and it's shown at a typical size here, right? It's typically not much larger. And if you see such a dialog box, this is actually from a virus checker. It's checking, it's checking, it's checking, or updating in this case, right? And at some point it's done, and you get an OK button, and you think it's done. You really have to carefully read what it says to see that it actually said that it was unsuccessful. Right? So this doesn't look like an error message, but it is. And then lots of people think that they can come up with a nicer looking version of a yes, no, or okay, cancel dialog part. But don't do that. Use the ones that are standard and that everyone will recognize. Here, more examples, right, of error messages, dialog boxes that pop up that do not really tell the user, right, what's the specific error, what do you need to do to correct this error. Right? You should give factual information at the level the user understands and give real options, right, real choices to solve the situation. Don't expect your user to be an expert who can understand the messages shown here. In your assignment, you're going to need input fields. For instance, for numbers. There is a standard input field that is good for arbitrary numbers, and that is the text field. How often in your interface for a thermostat are you going to need arbitrary numbers? You will deal with temperatures, you will deal with times, you may have to select a day of the week. Right? Nowhere is there any room for arbitrary numbers. So we are expecting that your interface will not make use of text fields. There are standard interface elements like spinners that are useful for relatively small ranges. And there are selection lists for a small number of choices, sometimes a larger number, but then they become scrolling. Right? For really large ranges, you can have a slider. Right? Maybe even a hierarchy of sliders like we saw earlier in the alphanumeric slider. If you are dealing with enumerated values, right, you can either use a selection list, and this is an interface element that is, for instance, used a lot for a list of countries. There are many countries in the world, right? So you use a selection list, right, to show all of them and let the user select one and have keyboard shortcuts to, for instance, jump to the part of the list with the countries starting with a given letter. If you have a small number of choices, you can use buttons or radio buttons, right, to select days of the week, for instance, or to set an option, turn an option on or off. Right? Don't use complex interfaces for something which is a simple choice between only a few options. Take this advice at heart. Right? That will result in usable interfaces in your projects. You will have happy users and you will get a good grade. Thank you for participating.